of number 3 around comments about a particular director in, I don't know how that's relevant as far as public input either. We are,
no, it's not.
okay, I'm hearing, excellent.
Video's live.
Thank you, and welcome to our June the 3rd regular meeting of Electoral Area Services Committee of the CVRD. I'd like to welcome all the directors and all the people watching and others in the lobby. I'd like to begin with just a couple of quick notes here about the fact that we're meeting in the territory of the Coast Salish, and some of us are in Nicholson territory. I'd like to remind everyone to put your electronics on silent, and you might even want to do that with your home phone landline if you still have one of those. I'd like you to keep yourself muted unless to speak, and also like to remind staff to keep muted and your video from not streaming unless you're called upon or unless you have something to provide some input. I'd like everyone to just raise your hands visually if you want to be acknowledged to be put on the speakers list or when we go to vote. And remind everyone that if you have a resolution to propose, if we're having a lengthy discussion and you've got a resolution you'd like to put on the table, to please take the time to compose it and email it to Ms. Legault and myself so that we have that and it can be read out for consideration. Just to remind everyone, the format will be when we're considering applications. First, we'll have the presentation, then there'll be questions through to staff. And then if the applicant is present, I understand we only have one applicant with us today, questions through to the applicant. And then if you have a comment or opinion or debate, we can do that when we have a resolution on the floor. So with that, I would like to go to the beginning of the meeting and to the approval of the agenda. And I have a couple of items just like to bring to your attention and request to be added to our agenda. The first is, it's under UB2, and it's supplemental information prepared by alternate director Haim, and it was all distributed to you late as an alternate director's report, but for it to be considered into the agenda, it is supplemental information under that item. It's not new business or it's not a separate report. And we also have an NB1, which is something that was discussed at the board, and it's a discussion around the business reopening under COVID-19. And I believe our General Manager of Land Use Services has provided everyone with some information late yesterday for consideration for that discussion. We don't have any resolutions to come with that, but we can look at that under NB1. So with that, I would be looking to the committee for a mover and a seconder on the agenda as amended. I moved by Director Acton, seconded by Director Kuhn. Is there anything we've missed or any other discussion on adoption of the agenda or approval of the agenda? Seeing none, I'll call a question. All those in favor? Are there any opposed? None opposed, that motion carries. Go to adoption of the minutes of our May 20th meeting. I have movers and seconders, moved by Director Smith, seconded by Director Yanni DiNardo. Any discussion on those minutes? I see none. I'll call the question. All in favor? Are there any opposed? I see none opposed. That motion carries. Given the fact that we might have some internet challenges and the likes throughout the meeting, I plan to be very purposeful and methodical in treating each item. So just bear with me on that front. I would go to item 3, business arising from the minutes. Does Ms. Legault or any of the directors have any items under business arising from the minutes? I see waving me off. Next to public input period, item number 4. Ms. Legault, I understand you have some submissions that have been sent to you. And just a reminder before Ms. Legault starts into the public input submissions, I'd like to remind anybody watching that you have an opportunity to pose a question to the chair on any of the items on the agenda at the end of the meeting. And you can email those questions to legislative services, all one word, at cvrd.bc.ca. And one other thing, if this starts to turn into a lengthy meeting, I've had requests in the past from directors to take a break at an hour, so we'll attempt to do that if we can. So with that, Ms. Legault, public input.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There's 4 items for public input period today. The first is regarding item C2 for the grant and aid request for Electoral Area B, Shawnigan Lake, to the Electoral Area Service Committee members. Last week, and this item is from Dave Hutchinson, editor, Shawnigan Focus Newspaper, Shawnigan Research Group member, and Shawnigan Residents Association member. Last week, I submitted a letter to the CVRD board in response to an agenda item providing information about the SRA milfoil campaign. The main point was that, although well-intentioned and effectively carried out, the promotion of mechanical harvesting with water temperatures above 10 degrees Celsius does more harm than good. This was based on statements in the Madrone Report, a document that has been accepted as scientifically valid. Director Acton's response was that you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. While understandable, it does not justify the $5,000 grant and aid request. What makes sense is to do the right thing at the right time in the right way. Prior to receiving additional funds, the SRA should revise their campaign and be encouraged to work with the Ministry of Forest, Lands and Natural Resource Operations, the CVRD, and credible professionals to come up with a comprehensive and well-managed harvesting plan that occurs when the water is colder. Relying solely on property owners to do the right thing with no monitoring or follow-up is inequitable and haphazard. There are also 2 other problems with this grant and aid proposal. One, the purpose of the GIA, grant and aid, is described as a full marketing blitz and information material on milfoil management for lakefront. It can be seen as a misuse of public funds to produce inaccurate information and then market that material to lakefront property owners with the hope that they seek the services of a designated dive company. Be a level playing field and no single company should be promoted. 2, there has been recent controversy over funding and responsibilities for watershed issues within the Shawnigan area. The Shawnigan Basin Society has been deprived of its AAP funding, and while the SRA continues to receive grant from Dave Hutchinson. The next item, Mr. Chair, is from Cliff Evans from Shawnigan Lake regarding item C2, the grant and aid request for Electoral Area B. The Shawnigan Residents Association request for $5,000 for a full marketing blitz and information material on milfoil management for lakefront owners. The campaign run last year, and from what I observed, it really had a lot of lakefront owners pulling milfoil. I've never seen so much milfoil fragmentation floating in the lake in my life. Milfoil is so thick in some parts of the lake that you can't drive a motorboat through it or swim or fish in it. This year, the lake looks like it is infested with milfoil worse than ever. Lakefront owners are going to clear the milfoil out of their dock and swimming areas so they can enjoy it, and in some cases reap profits from it. It is common knowledge that the removal of milfoil is best done in cool water when it is not growing, but this takes very special, expensive equipment such as a milfoil combine, harvest machine, a special rototiller, and specialized equipment for divers working around docks and water intake pipes. All this equipment may not be practical in Shawnigan Lake because of the number of docks and water intake pipes, but specialized equipment will be needed. Okanagan Watershed Board has been managing milfoil for years and hasn't yet eradicated milfoil, but have learned how to control it so it is acceptable for fishing, swimming, and increasing the value of lakefront property. The Okanagan Watershed, the local government, have leveraged support from the provincial government to supply expensive equipment to do the job. The local waterfront owners are not entirely funding milfoil management like they are in Shawnigan Lake. If the Blitz campaign educates the public on when milfoil should be pulled in perhaps November when it's not growing, how we can slow down the deposits of soil and nutrients from soil deposit sites, and most importantly, the proper method of pulling the milfoil out to minimize fragmentation, the money invested will be well worth it. We need feedback from the campaign on milfoil harvested, which will equal the amount of nutrients they harvested from the lake. We need to get the Shawnigan Basin Society supported by the CVRD so we can leverage provincial and corporate funds just like the Okanagan Watershed and Cowichan Watershed have done. We look forward to any cooperation you can give us. Thank you, Ms. Evans. The third item is with respect to item R3, the loan authorization bylaw number 438, Saltair water treatment upgrade. And this is submitted by Jim Whitaker, Chair of the Saltair Water Advisory Committee. And he writes, this changes the financing and the filtration unit for the Saltair water treatment system. Saltair residents have demonstrated their extreme interest in the Saltair water system. In July 2012, Saltair residents took the advice of the CVRD staff and passed a bylaw where Saltair taxpayers would take on an increase in taxation to fund yearly upgrades to our aging distribution system. It was a close vote, but the CVRD representative told us that we could get a grant to help pay for the upgrades, so the bylaw was passed. The grant never came, and if residents had known that before voting, the bylaw would not have passed. Now another bylaw is being proposed. This bylaw changes the type of filtration system without any consultation with the Saltair taxpayers. We had many meetings to decide on which filtration unit would be the best for Saltair. This bylaw also changes the method of financing, and that could not have come at a worse time. With the many layoffs and financial hardships being suffered because of COVID-19, Saltair residents are not ready for and cannot afford a new financial burden. When it was learned that the Shawnigan North water system will be getting the identical filtration system and has a more favorable financing bylaw than what is proposed for Saltair, the procedural unfairness is glaring. 2 identical filtration systems and 2 different treatments by the CVRD. What are the differences between the $6 million and $3.7 million systems? What consultation has taken place with the Saltair taxpayers to compare the 2 systems? Has the Saltair water been analyzed to then select systems that will provide best filtration, and have these systems been tested on Saltair water from Stocking Lake? More community consultation and testing is required prior to any loan bylaw being authorized. Another outrageous difference is the way the Vancouver Island Health Authority is treating the 2 systems. VHA has mandated that all open sources of community drinking water must have a filtration system. Nanaimo Health has issued Saltair with a water contravention order, which forbids any further repairs or taxpayer annually funded Saltair water distribution system upgrades because of not having a filtration system yet. Duncan Island Health did not follow the Vancouver Island Health Authority's mandated compliance. They did not require the taxpayers of Shawnigan Lake North to install a filtration system at the same time that this compliance issue was ordered. The 2 systems were not treated the same. Obviously, a public meeting cannot be held, but our committee would appreciate a meeting with a CVRD representative to address Saltair's concerns. Signed, Jim Whitaker. And the final item is from Susan Kaufman. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair. I'd like to provide comment on the following items. Item UB1, APCs and Park Commission's policy. Recognizing that the items up for discussion today are in the realm of the EASC directors, I would respectfully suggest, in the light of COVID-19 crisis and in keeping with reducing expenditures wherever possible, that the CVRD forego any appreciation expenditures for 2020. And on item UB2, Regional District of Nanaimo Land Use Referral, although there has been discussions on where the appropriate place for consideration of this item have been made, it is concerning that this referral letter was dated April 29th, 2020, and yet did not land on an agenda until May 27th, putting the CVRD not only into a time crunch for response, but once again leaving without the ability to make informed comments. The title and substance of the referral indicates the RDN was seeking comments on the CVRD's areas of responsibility, which one would presume to include the effects of land use on the Cassidy Aquifer and impacts to surrounding properties such as ALR lands. For those of us who have followed the CVRD over the course of many years, know that the former director of Area H consistently raised concerns over this aquifer. AIM should be commended for speaking up and requesting an opportunity for more fulsome discussion on these important land use issues. This is signed Susan Kaufman, and with that concludes public input period. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Legault. And I just note that we seem to have a call-in user _2 in my screen, my field of view here, and don't know who that might be, and if you can take care of that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That is the applicant who was having audio issues earlier. He's called in instead, and I'm going to move him into the lobby now.
Well, I'm just wondering if it might be appropriate for us to go straight? Is he not, is that, is he with R1 or R2? R1?
R1.
Would it be appropriate to just go to that item and begin discussion on that? I'm seeing nodding from around the room. Is staff ready to, if I bump that up and begin discussion on that particular item? Directors are all ready? So I think we'll do that. So we'll bump R1 up to address that item now, and then we'll go back to the grants and aid. And I believe we would be calling on, I see Ms. Wright has popped up and Mr. Limshu has popped up, and our applicant is with us as well. So I will turn to Mr. Limshu, and just before you get underway, I'd like to remind everyone that the next board meeting, where items from today's meeting, if appropriate, will go to the June 10th meeting of the board, and our next Electoral Area Services Committee meeting is June 17th. So with that, R1 is the item on the floor now, and I turn to Mr. Limshu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can everybody hear me okay? I'm just going to share my screen and everyone, so just please bear with me. Okay, thank you very much. So item R1 relates to application number RZ19C03, the Cedars at Cobble Hill. The property is located at 3741 Holland Avenue. So the Cedars at Cobble Hill, for those of you that don't know, is a substance abuse and addiction treatment facility licensed by Vancouver Island Health. The applicant is seeking to bring the property into compliance with the applicable CVRD regulations in order to legalize a number of existing uses and to allow for a future expansion of the facility. Back in on August 28, 2019, the CVRD board considered two applications. First application related to the rezoning application before you, RZ19C03, and the second application related to ALR application number ALR19C01. The board gave first reading to the bylaws associated with application number RZ19C03, and those bylaws are in your packages, attachments B and C. They also gave direction to forward the non-farm use, They also gave direction to forward the non-farm use application to the Agricultural Land Commission with recommendation for approval to allow for the expansion of the existing alcohol and drug addiction treatment center. So the plan that you see before you basically indicates the existing buildings on the property, and the treatment facility site pertains to this area outlined in blue. The entire parcel encompasses both the areas in blue and green. The area in green would basically remain primary use for agriculture. We've since received correspondence back from the Agricultural Land Commission in support of the application. There are a number of conditions that the Land Commission has put forward, and those conditions have been outlined in the staff report, as well as if you take a look at attachment E, the actual letter from the Land Commission is attached for your information as well. So with that, I'm prepared to answer any questions that may come up.
Thank you, Mr. Limshu. Could you please lower your presentation so I can see our colleagues around the table? And I see we have Director Acton. So this will be questions for staff. And Director Acton, I have Director Wilson. Does anyone else have any questions for staff? Director Acton, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question would be, would it be out of the ordinary if we skip the public hearing? Because I don't feel like there will be any opposition to this, and they've done a proper process so far, and I think to save time and money would be worthwhile looking at not holding the public hearing.
Mr. Limshu.
So in response to that question, if we were only dealing with an amendment to the zoning, certainly that is an option. But in this particular case, we're amending both the official community plan and the zoning bylaw so that everything aligns correctly.
Follow-up, Director Acton.
Well, have we received any opposition letters so far? Or we've seen this application for a while now. So if the public had any concerns, they would have been able to have contacted us so far. And would there also be signage up on site?
Mr. Limshew.
It is, as far as I can tell, that we have not received any correspondence opposing. I'll certainly defer to Planner Lauren Wright to confirm that
because she is the planner handling the file.
Ms. Wright.
Yes.
Welcome.
Hello. Yes, that's correct. We have not received any correspondence in relation to this file at all.
Just for all the directors' information and for the public that are watching, I believe we're anticipating a possible procedure for dealing with public hearings of virtual format coming forward in 2 weeks' time. So I don't believe that that skipping the step of having a public hearing is something that would be appropriate, in that we're trying to proceed as quickly as possible. And I think we can have a public hearing in a virtual format fairly quickly. So at this point, I anticipate we should have something, a process coming forward. And I believe Mr. Limshew's correct, given it's an OCP amendment as well. And I don't know that we can legally waive a public hearing in this scenario, but I'll turn to Ms. Chirelf, whose screen has just popped up. Ms. Chirelf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to confirm that, yes, you do need to have a public hearing if you're amending in an official community plan. The legislation doesn't allow for the public hearing to be waived, only for a zoning bylaw that complies with an OCP.
Thank you, Ms. Chirelf. Does that conclude your questions for staff, Director Acton? Director Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This particular application is a good one, and I'm pleased to hear that the ALR has come back with
We're losing him, Director Wilson.
I'll just move the recommendations if I can, if that's okay, without any further ado.
I'll come back to you. I'll come back to you.
Did you hear it?
I've heard you, Director Wilson. I believe the applicant wanted to be heard today, so I will come back to you to move that in just a moment after we've heard from the applicant. No more questions for staff?
Okay. No,
Okay.
that's it. Thank you.
Could we bring the applicant into the meeting for any additional comments that he might have?
Mr. Chair, it's Bernie Willick, the agent for the applicant, the owners of Cedars at Cobble Hill. I was just on the line to answer any questions that the board or any of its members might have in relation to the application. We're delighted that the Agricultural Land Commission fully supported our application. There is some kind of administrative requirements on our part, sending them some maps and some registrations, but other than that, we're delighted, and I'm glad to see that we're going to be moving on.
Thank you, Mr. Willick. It looks like there's fairly broad support amongst directors at this point to move forward to the next step. Are there any questions for Mr. Willick? I see none, so I'll turn to Director Wilson, and if you'd like to move the recommended resolution, I'll read it out in a minute. He's moving it, and I think Director Yanni DiNardo was going to second it. And the recommendation is that it be recommended to the board, 1, that CVRD bylaw number 4291, Electoral Area C, South Cowichan OCP Amendment bylaw 3741 Holland Avenue, 2019, and CVRD bylaw number 4292, Electoral Areas A and C, South Cowichan Zoning Amendment bylaw 3741 Holland Avenue, 2019, be forwarded to the board for consideration of second reading. 2, that a public hearing be scheduled for CVRD bylaw, same bylaw, and same OCP amendment, with directors from electoral areas B, C, and F as delegates. That's been duly moved and seconded. Any discussion or debate on this item? given for appropriate bandwidth lag time? Seeing no hands waving in the air, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Are there any directors opposed? I see none opposed. That motion carries, and that item should go to the board on the 10th of June. Thank you very much, Mr. Willick.
Thank you, everybody. I'll sign off now. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Legault. We will now go back up to correspondence, and we have items. The first item is C1, and I'll read the recommendation that it be recommended to the board that a grant and aid, Electoral Area C Cobble Hill, in the amount of $1,000 be provided to CMS Food Bank Society to provide support for the purchase of fresh fruits and vegetables. I will turn to Director Wilson. Would you like to move that recommendation?
Yes, I would, please, Mr. Chair. And just a quick word of information.
Let me get a seconder.
Okay.
Seconded by Director Kuhn. Director Wilson, go ahead.
Hang on a second. Yeah, I think I'm on again now, aren't I? Okay. Yeah, this is one of those things which is slipping by, unfortunately. The province, the feds, everybody is helping the homeless. And at the moment, these groups like mothers and children who are not working because of whatever reason are finding it hard going. The CMS Food Bank and all other food banks are suffering badly. This is a way of taking some of the money which we've recouped from, let's say, music in the park, etc., and putting it into a place where hopefully it will do some good to help those who have slipped through the cracks.
Thank you for that, Director Wilson. Are there any other comments or questions on the resolution on the floor? I'll now call the question. Show of hands, all in favor? Are there any opposed? None opposed. That motion carries, and we'll go to the June 10th board meeting. Item C2. The recommendation is that it be recommended to the board that a grant and aid, Electoral Area B, Shawnigan Lake, in the amount of $5,000 be provided to Shawnigan Residents Association to support the full marketing blitz and information material for lakefront owners on milfoil management. Turn to the director for the area. Moving the recommendation, seconded by Director Yanni DiNardo. Any discussion on this item? Director Acton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I guess I'll comment a bit since we had a couple members of the public write in. First, it's a little disappointing that they didn't pick up the phone and call me because I personally know them, and one in particular has been at the CVRD saying we need to work together. So I encourage them to call me between now and the board. And one item that they should know is the only environmental professional that is on the Basin Society was actually part of the discussion and part of the decision to do this program again this year. MOE, DFO, Flinro agreed the program is worthwhile and that they approve it. They do not approve what has been suggested otherwise, to pull the plant in October when it is colder. And, you know, like I said before, the Madrone report does state that you have to have the proper permits in place and timing that the other agencies will allow. And so last year, and to add to this too, last year there were a lot of complaints about the milfoil, and that sparked getting this information out. This year, I'm actually hearing that there's improvement and there's not so much anxiety around doing this information this year. So if these two members are really not happy and they want to talk to Dave Monday and, you know, and they don't want to support it, I'm happy to pull it. I just wanted to carry on with the program to keep the community informed. And yeah, so I don't know if anyone wants to ask anything about it, but yeah, yeah, we don't have any other means to do things like this. So at the moment, it's the best we've got, unless somebody has a better idea. And if Mr. Hutchinson would like to contact me and help out and try and get that changed with the ministry, we can do that. And Dave Monday was also trying to get that to be changed, but it's not what we have at the moment.
Thank you, Director Acton. And I think that if we are to follow the lead of the director for the area, that you've got a week to have individuals from your community reach out, and when we come to the board meeting next week, if there's you have a different idea or you'd like to pull this request, the ultimate authorization of this will happen at the board next week. So appropriate notice to your community that if people would like to speak with you further about this, they can. So seeing no other hands in the air, I've read the resolution. I will now call the question. All those in favor? Are there any opposed? That motion carries unanimously. Thank you. Now we have dealt with the correspondence. Ms. Legault, I see no information items. I believe we've dealt with R1. So that brings us to R2, which is a report from Inspection and Enforcement Division. And I would call on Mr. McDonald, who's just popped up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There's a report and resolution in front of you. I have no presentation. Liquor primary structural change applications from the Liquor and Cannabis Regulation Branch give local governments an opportunity to either opt out or comment on proposed changes. In this case, the applicant is Couch and Golf Club, and they're located at 4955 Trans-Canada Highway. Schedule A has got a floor plan, and in this case, what's happened is kind of a cleanup. Right now, they have sort of a mix of half liquor primary and half food primary. So with contact that they had with the liquor branch, it had been proposed that they just convert it all to liquor primary. So because they are technically increasing liquor primary, it had to go through the application process. But in this case, they're not increasing the occupant load. It's just going to be all liquor primary, and they will still be serving food. So if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. I think that Director Yanni DiNardo was thinking about moving the resolution. That's exactly what she was thinking of doing. Director Acton, were you seconding? It looks like we have seconders all around the room. So seconded by Director Kuhn. Any discussion, questions on this item? Pretty straightforward. Seeing none, I will now call the question. All in favor? Are there any opposed? I see none opposed. That motion carries. Thank you, Mr. McDonald. R3, a report from the Water Management Division. Mr. Dennison.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Always good to be here. So the first report is on the Saltair water system. Two of our systems, Saltair and Shawnigan, are currently out of compliance with Island Health's what we call the 43210 filtration requirement. We actually received a contravention order in January, which is attached to the report for Saltair, in which they required an updated plan for how we're going to proceed to meet the requirements of the regulation. One of the the attempts that we've been doing for a while now is to get a grant to make that much more affordable for our customers. In fact, we've recently submitted the third grant for Saltair, hoping to get some funding to make the financial burden less. And to be honest, we haven't pressed ahead with this work too much because we've been hoping to get that grant. So we still are hoping, but we really do need to show some progress towards actually getting this done, even if we are not able to get a grant. So we've had some costing done, and we would like to proceed at least with the first three readings for this borrowing bylaw for $3.7 million. So we report that to Island Health as showing progress. We will And a subsequent meeting will come back with the consent process, likely in AAP would be the recommendation, but that will be separately decided. At this point, we'd really like to show some progress towards meeting the compliance requirements for Saltair.
Thank you, Mr. Dennison. I see Director Smith has her hand up. Director Smith, would you like to ask a question to Mr. Dennison, or what's your pleasure?
Well, my pleasure is I'd like to make a bit of a statement in regards to this at the moment.
Well, can I interrupt Director Smith for just a moment? If you want to have discussion and debate on the resolution, that's more than appropriate. If you don't have any questions for Mr. Dennison, we should probably get something on the floor for debate and discussion. Director Smith?
I have a resolution then, but I'd like.
Okay, Director Smith, do you have a resolution that you could, that you presented to staff, or are you just giving us a new resolution?
Angie has a copy of it.
Okay, please proceed.
I recommend that the CVRD staff write a letter to Health Protection and Environmental Services, the Honorable Adrian Dix, Minister of Health, and the Honorable Selena Robinson, Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing, requesting a reconsideration and deferral of the water contravention order and the CVRD proposed timeline for the Saltair water system treatment expansion project due to COVID-19 and the economic impact upon the Saltair taxpayers and their ability to fund a filtration system at this time without a grant allocation.
Thank you. Director Yanni DiNardo, was that a seconding motion? Okay, so just before I accept the resolution, I'd like to get some clarity. So this has been presented to Ms. Legault, and I would like to perhaps ask Director Smith. So are you putting this resolution forward and not suggesting we move forward with the resolution that's contained in the report? Or are you going to do both?
That's correct. I have another resolution regarding a specific amount that I would also like to make.
Okay, well, let's deal with the resolution on the floor. Right. So that's a letter that's been prepared. Has it been distributed to anyone other than Ms. Legault, and have any other staff reviewed it, or are we just wanting to proceed with that? I look to the committee. Generally, it would be nice to have a little bit of background as to I think we understand the intent. You want a deferral due to COVID-19 on any orders from, that's fair enough.
So
is that the intent?
I'd like to speak to my...
Please proceed.
Okay, because, all right. So due to the COVID-19 pandemic emergency, there has been an economic impact upon the whole world, including Saltair taxpayers and their ability to finance a $3.7 million loan. All unfunded capital projects need to be deferred until the economy and employment begin to stabilize. Anything else is reckless disregard for the situation many taxpayers find themselves in, especially the young families and seniors. Both the Saltair water system and the Shawnigan Lake North water system as open water sources require $6 million filtration systems, water treatment upgrades to comply with the Drinking Water Protection Act and the Drinking Water Protection Regulations 43210. I would like to point out many inconsistencies and lack of procedural fairness. Both systems have applied for grants for $6 million. The board last week authorized a loan bylaw of $1,620,000 for the Shawnigan Lake North water system based on their system receiving a grant, not $3.7 million based on if this system does not receive a grant. Both systems are under the BC Health Protection and Environmental Services. The Saltair system is under the Nanaimo office and the Shawnigan Lake North is under the Duncan office, both same provincial body. Saltair Water System received a water contravention order in January 2020. Shawnigan Lake did not receive one. Both systems are out of compliance. The work permits to continue working on the Saltair Water System, aging distribution system are being withheld by the Nanaimo office, yet the Shawnigan Lake North system is receiving their work permits from the Duncan office. The inconsistencies between the two offices of the BC Health Protection and Environmental Services brings into question procedural fairness and a harmonized process throughout all BC offices dealing with mandated filtration systems. There have been no consultation with the Saltair community to determine the differences and benefits between a $6 million system and a $3.7 million system prior to this loan bylaw being prepared. So I think it's important that we take all those things into consideration. When the contravention order was document came out in January, it does say if there's sufficient new evidence for a reconsideration. And I think that with COVID-19, we're in a position where we need to have them reconsider this decision that the contravention has gone forward. The timeline by the CVRD staff that was put together in response was on the 5th of March. And that response has dates and times that are just not possible with COVID-19. So the staff has done a good job of putting together a timeline, but we can't meet that timeline either with going through COVID. I think it's important that if we're having both water systems out of compliance, we need to actually make sure that the process is equal for both systems. And there seems to be a discrepancy between the offices. So we need to deal with a couple of different issues. One is the amount that we're being sort of almost forced to apply for, and another one not. We're also dealing with two offices that also need to look at their policies and procedures when it comes to this. So I'd like to support my first recommendation with regards to the asking for a deferment on this process at this time.
Thank you, Director Smith. So I want to fall back to best practices in that I believe that there are likely implications to potential grant qualification and the likes. I've had some discussion with Mr. Dennison, and I would like to inquire as to the timeliness of and timelines as to whether or not there's possible grants at risk and the likes. I fully understand Director Smith's reasoning for questioning the dual authorities within our region and the likes, but this feels to me as a there's a lot of implications that go beyond just the request that is being proposed by this resolution. I gather we have other resolutions coming that will follow, and I feel unprepared and don't have enough information to be making on-the-fly decisions. I don't know how the rest of the committee feels, but at this point, are there any implications by deferral of the resolution that's in the staff report, Mr. Dennison?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. No, not for this. This is not supporting a grant application. We already did that for Saltair in the earlier intake, so that's already been covered. The one recently done for Shawnigan Lake was necessary for the grant application. Just a little bit of a word too, so that it's a little clearer for the directors. We're a bit tactical in our applications to some degree. So if we're applying for a grant, we make sure we apply for plenty. And then if we have required to have the 3 readings of a bylaw to support our share of that, well, we get that through in order to make sure we have it so we could submit it to support the grant. So we've got that in and covered. So for example, in Shawnigan Lake, we had that bylaw go through, or the first 3 readings go through already. We will likely have to come forward with a full meal deal for the expense for the customers, in which case we would, look to optimize the cost as much as possible if they're paying 100%. So Shawnigan is in the same situation as Saltaire. Why Island Health treats them very differently, I just don't know. I can't answer that, except for to say that there's different offices and different health officers involved, and they seem to treat it differently. But we are in the same situation in Shawnigan. We will be bringing bylaws forward in the same way as we do here. Immediately answer the question, no, it's not a problem for a grant application.
Thank you, Mr. Dennison. Director Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Going way back into some of the high-level computer languaging, there used to be a thing called a conditional branch, and this is exactly what this sounds like that Mr. Dennison's trying to fight with. If we do that, then this will happen, and if we don't do that, then the other will happen. Which way do we go? So it's all very confusing. And I can understand the aspect that Director Smith is coming from. There is a problem with financing by people out there. That was one of the reasons I put forward my grant in aid. So I'm going to be fully supporting this resolution that she's put forward.
Director Nicholson.
Thank you. I guess my question is for staff, if I may. It's about the safety. This is a drinking water issue, and it strikes me that there may be some risk to postponing investment and getting on with getting a treatment system happening. And I'm just wondering about the level of risk.
I think that was to you, Mr. Dennison. Can you rejoin us?
Yes. That's a very difficult question to answer. It's to be frank, if you asked me to spend millions of dollars to improve the health of the customers of, say, Saltaire or Shawnigan Lake, it wouldn't be this way. I'd spend it in other ways that would be better for their health. I don't know. We haven't got the reporting and what the risk is. This is a blanket policy. It's everywhere in BC, and they're trying to meet international standards. You see it all over elsewhere in North America. The same kinds of requirements for surface water. They're very, very conservative with their approaches to this. So what the real risk would be of a delay, I can't say. I can say that the quality of water from Stocking Lake is exceptional. It's very high clarity, always year round. We have no problems, treating it and running it through our UV and chlorination systems. There is some difficulty meeting the disinfection byproduct numbers consistently. But when you treat with chlorine, there's some byproducts that arise out of that. And sometimes we're above the limit, sometimes we're under. So it kind of waves through there. So there is some risk from that. Hard to know how you'd actually calculate that. But there is some recognition, particularly of that aspect.
Thank you, Mr. Dennison. I've got 2 people on the list right now. I've got Director Kuhn and Director Smith. Director Smith has spoken already, so I'll go to Director Kuhn.
Yeah, I'm in support of what Director Smith is proposing there. I mean, that system, the way they have it now, has been in existence for how many years now? Have they had any big problems? Probably not. So it's really, in essence, it's a bureaucratic move. Yes, it's being incorporated everywhere, and we all have to adhere to that. And even if the present system is okay, we'll have to go into 4-3-2-1. I was faced with that here in UVO. And I think Director Smith has a really good issue, and that is you cannot have 2 different reactions to a similar problem just because they're different offices. I mean, there's no excuse. They should get the act in order.
Thank you, Director Kuhn. Director Smith.
Thank you. I'd just like to clarify some information regarding our grant application. In 2012, the Saltair taxpayers increased their taxation to cover our aging distribution system. We increased it to collect 300,000 additional funds every year and then put that into the aging distribution system. We have those funds available to pay our portion of the grant application. So technically, we don't need to put in a loan information as Shawnigan did for theirs, because we already would be able to do a 5-year short-term loan and cover those funds by the amount of money that we're collecting at this point. We just wouldn't be able to do our distribution upgrades. Another point I'd like to make that I think is sort of what Mr. Dennison is saying is there's things that can't be recorded as to the health impacts of the combination of the chlorination and the turbidity. We've been under this order since when it came out in approximately 2012. So the time's gone on. But even when we do put in a filtration system, we're going to put it into old aging asbestos pipes, and that's what's going to arrive at our door. So we're going to take, it seems quite complicated to put something, this much money into a filtration system to put into aging old asbestos pipes. I know that in the central Okanagan, a system that has been also mandated is looking at putting in point of entry systems, and because the Drinking Water Protection Act is older, new technology is out there. So we may not have even finished exploring what we need to explore at this time. So I would thank everyone for listening at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Smith. So a couple of things here. We've got a duly moved and seconded resolution, and I had no prior knowledge in advance of the meeting that there would be significant deviation from the staff report. So I think that it's more than appropriate to vote on the resolution that Director Smith has put before us. I will ask Ms. Legault to read it out. She's got it there. And I understand there's subsequent resolutions to come forward. So I think in all best practices and due fairness to the committee, I think that we'll call the question on that resolution. And then I'm going to suggest that the subsequent resolutions that Director Smith is putting forward be distributed to directors. We'll call a quick break so that everybody can consider the subsequent resolutions that are being forwarded. And then we'll reconvene. And we're just about at an hour, so we'll have a quick break. So with that, Ms. Legault, could you read the resolution that's been put on the floor?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I thought it be recommended to the board that CVRD staff write a letter to Health Protection and Environmental Services, the Honourable Adrian Dix, Minister of Health, and the Honourable Selena Robinson, Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing, requesting a reconsideration and deferral of the water contravention order and the CVRD proposed timeline for the Saltair water system treatment expansion project due to COVID-19 and the economic impact upon the Saltair taxpayers and their ability to fund a filtration system at this time without a grant allocation.
Thank you, Ms. Legault. Everyone is clear on the resolution. Call the question. All those in favor? Are there any opposed? There's none opposed. Director Salmon, you seem to have some bandwidth lag going on there, so you can get your hand up early and bring it down quickly.
Yeah, I'll reboot during the break and see if I can fix that.
Fair enough. So, Director Smith, you've got some subsequent resolutions that you want to put forward and that haven't been distributed in advance. Yeah, I see you waving, Director Smith.
I only have one.
Okay,
so
and it's on the same item.
I'll send it.
If you would. So I'm going to call for a short break. If you could send it to your colleagues so that we can have a look at it and consider it during the break. And it's we'll come back at 2:35. Reconvene at 2:35. Remember to turn your microphone and your video feed off.
Video's live.
Thank you. So welcome back, everyone. I just I've had an opportunity to finally look at the material that Director Smith has sent out to us, reviewing the R3, and I'm turning to Ms. Legault because I don't know if we want extra time for these things to be addressed, or whether or not we might be able to, be a little bit more efficient in this. It doesn't seem to make a whole bunch of sense for us to, and given the proposed resolution that's been sent out, for us to recommend to the board, and then the board refer back and it go back to staff. Can't we just as committee refer this item back to staff for redrafting of the recommendation and it come back and go to the board? Isn't that just the simplest and easiest way to go? Or is there another reason why you wouldn't want to do that, Director Smith? Well, let's ask Ms. Legault first. Can we just do that?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The preferred course of action is always to have the committee recommendation endorsed by the board. I understand the efficiency aspect, but it helps us not only with tracking, but also ensuring that best practices are followed.
Okay. Turn to Director Smith.
I will read out my recommendation. I recommend that loan authorization number, bylaw number 4328, Saltair water system treatment upgrades, be sent back to staff to write a bylaw to authorize the borrowing of funds to finance a portion of the water treatment project for the Saltair water system based on receiving a grant, with the same wording as the Shawnigan Lake North bylaw number 4327.
Hang on, before that's seconded, let's get the proper terminology into the resolution. Not that Director Smith recommends, but the committee recommends to the board, or that it be recommended to the board, so that we've got the correct wording in this. And Director Wilson, were you seconding that resolution? Okay, he's seconding that resolution. So everybody's got it in writing. She's read it out. We just tweaked the words at the beginning because there's no individual recommendation. I see Director Acton has her hand up, and we'll follow with Director Smith afterwards. Director Acton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to support the director of the area, and I'm just curious, what I have found in local government, when you try and find the solution, it kind of doesn't work well. It works best if you just state what your issue is and allow staff to come up with the solution instead of us trying to come up with the solution, and we end up creating issues that we didn't know we were creating. So I guess I would also ask, has Director Smith consulted with staff before coming up with this resolution? And I feel like the first resolution was probably good enough that staff could come back with something.
Director Smith, you're next on the list.
Well, that was a question for Director Smith, if she has actually worked with staff to come up with this recommendation.
That's why I've just asked Director Smith to respond.
Thank you. I have not been able to work with staff in regards to this. I only saw the contravention order to read it at the same time as the rest of the directors. I hadn't had a previous opportunity. It hadn't been supplied to me as the area director of the Saltair water system. So I did read it on the weekend, and I was only able to contact staff over the last couple of days. And I've been trying to figure out whether Shawnigan Lake North had a contravention order or didn't have a contravention order, whether that system was in compliance or not in compliance. So I have reached out to staff to ask a few questions. I'd like to continue the conversation with them. One of the things that Mr. Dennison did indicate is that for the island health, we do need to show that we are making some sort of progress here financially. And what I'm trying to do is do that by saying that the Saltair water system would be willing to do the same as the Shawnigan Lake North water system in that. And that indicates to Island Health that not only along with the letter of asking for a deferment, we are actually showing that we are willing to move along in a financial direction in regards to that, to do that portion based on a grant. You may feel it's better if I have the conversation with staff. There's some options available for us financially. So if you feel that it should just go with the first recommendation, or whether we should try to pursue the second recommendation so that it could be written into the letter to say we say that, to indicate that the Saltair water system is actually willing to put some funding into it on top of also the other funding that we actually do have available for the grant application that we already have out there. So it's kind of two pots of money available.
Director Acton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, just for follow-up. So I think we should leave this up to staff. I think they've heard our conversation, they've heard your concerns, Director Smith, and they can come back and move forward. We're just we're really, it's not our role to find the solution. And I think we could actually be, causing some hurdles that we don't even need to, and not getting where we want to get.
Thank you, Director Acton. Director Smith, go ahead.
I would like to ask Mr. Dennison where he would like to go with this.
Mr. Dennison, your observations, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So to be clear about this, as far as there seems to be a perception of unfairness between, or at least how staff are handling things in Shawnigan Lake versus Saltair. Clearly, Island Health has different expectations between the two services. Again, as I said before, I don't know why that is. The earlier bylaw that we went through, the borrowing bylaw for Shawnigan, was just what we needed for the grant application. We had to get it through right away, otherwise we would lose our application. So we did that quickly. In reality, in both cases, we're going to need a consent process of our public. And we are not going to go through a consent process based on getting a grant. And then if we don't get the grant, go back and do another consent process for a new number. At least I would very strongly recommend we not do that. That would be very, very confusing and very difficult for people, for our customers to understand what's going on. Why we just did a consent for one low number and now we're back with a much larger number. And for both of them, we do need to consider going ahead with a consent process. So our thinking on a staff level was that we would go to consent with the larger number, which would enable either getting the grant and only borrowing a smaller amount. In fact, as Director Smith has indicated, with Saltair, the number we can achieve through using our reserves we have in hand, plus a small amount of temporary borrowing, we can meet that requirement there. In Shawnigan Lake, we'd have to do longer term borrowing. But for the full cost, for both of them, we think it'd be better to get consent for the full number that we need. And so, in fact, likely what we would do with Shawnigan Lake is rescind our earlier 3 readings and replace it with the readings for a full cost consent process. Go to our public there, explain what there's a requirement, we have to meet it. And then, so that would be fair then between Saltair and Shawnigan Lake. The same process that we bring the full amount through. We are trying to meet the requirements for Island Health. Frankly, the board can decide otherwise, but on a staff level, we feel obliged to bring forward recommendations to you to meet the requirements as they're being imposed on the regional district. So that's why we take it a certain way. The board may decide otherwise.
Follow up, Director Smith.
So I think that concerns are there's a $6 million project, and then there's a 3.7 million. And the difference is fairly hefty, depending on whether you get a grant or we don't get a grant. And I think that looking at the more expensive system may be something that the residents in Saltaire would look at. So if we tie ourselves to only a $3.7 million loan, and we may need more, then we're back at the table again. So I think right now, let's put this just back to staff for a further discussion, and that would be the best for the moment. Thank you.
Alternate Director Haim.
Thank you. Just a question to Mr. Dennison, just related to the differences in the two loan authorization bylaws and the requirements for the grant applications. Was there previously any sort of loan authorization done for the Saltaire system for the grant application for that system, or is this also satisfying theoretically any condition for a grant application?
Mr. Dennison.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So for Saltaire, because we have not been allowed to proceed with our pipe replacement program, we've been accumulating funds of $300,000 a year. So between those accumulated funds, and we're not allowed to replace the pipe because we're out of compliance on our 43210. So that's the approach Island Health has taken. So we are accumulating those funds. And between those accumulations and temporary borrowing, we'd be able to achieve the required amount for the grant for a upgrade that includes the grant funding. Because it's not nearly as much money, right? Because they pay for a lot of the grant, or a lot of the cost. So we didn't have to do a bylaw because that was open to us because of those funds available. Whereas in Shawnigan Lake, we don't have any reserves or very little reserves. And so we would have to borrow the full amount.
So for clarification, and despite what we've heard already, is it more than appropriate to, or is it appropriate to refer R3 back to staff? Have you heard enough, Mr. Dennison, to be able to take what you've heard from today's discussion and come back with another resolution?
Sure, I would be pleased to discuss this with both directors, actually, so everybody knows exactly what the thinking is and why there's different kinds of numbers floating around and that sort of thing. Sure, that would be just fine.
I would appreciate the clarity on that. So, Director Smith, would you like to move that resolution? No?
Yes, I'd like to move that resolution that R3 be sent back to staff. Thank you.
So the resolution is that it be referred back to staff. Is there a second, or seconded by Director Kuhn? So I see Ms. Legault furiously writing up the referral resolution and being methodical due to bandwidth lag time. I'll call the question. All those in favor? Are there any opposed? None opposed. The referral motion carries. Next item, R4. Who's going to be taking that one? Mr. Dennison?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. As part of our pandemic and in preparation for possible challenges to continuing operations with the staffing levels, should there have been problems, the provincial government had requested a long time ago that local governments create mutual aid agreements. So a number of them on the island here, ourselves, we've got a big list, RDN, Comox Valley, Regional District, Clayquot, Qualicum Beach, Town of Qualicum Beach, District of Lanceville, District of Parksville, and City of Nanaimo all work together with a bevy of lawyers to create this mutual aid agreement. It seems to have arrived in its perfection sometime after the requirements could possibly have come into place. But anyway, at least it's a nice thing to do. It's not an owner's agreement. There would be no impingement on our ability to provide our services to our own customers. It would only be if we have surplus capacity to provide loaners to other areas. And the agreement basically covers how you recover costs for that and that kind of thing. And it gives each of the areas perfect freedom to decide whether they have that surplus capacity or not. So it's a kind of a feel-good agreement, but we can recommend it.
Who's feeling good? Director Nicholson is moving and Director Salmon is seconding. And the resolution is that it be recommended to the board that the mutual aid agreement with neighboring jurisdictions to ensure that wastewater and drinking water services are maintained during the COVID-19 state of emergency be approved. And I'm going to take this opportunity to just comment. I'll absolutely support this, but this seemed to be one of those maybe knee-jerk reaction, feel-good ideas that may not have been all that well thought through, because I think that it's an odd mix of regional districts, municipalities of different sizes. I could see the municipality in North Cowichan having this kind of arrangement with the city of Nanaimo, but as Mr. Dennison has told us so many times, that our biggest system is micro in comparison to most others. So would there even be the appropriateness of skill levels for our people, if they were surplus, to go into some of these other jurisdictions to lend a hand? But given all the time and effort that's been put forward on this one, I think that if we were to recommend to the board that this go through, then I think no harm, no foul. So I've said it. So any other discussion on this item? We'll call a question. All in favor? Any opposed? Not opposed. The motion carries. All right. We now go to number 9, unfinished business. Ms. Legault, would you introduce our unfinished, I guess it's Ms. Legault introducing our unfinished business for us. UB1.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's a report from the Finance Division, appreciation for APCs and Parks Commission's policy, referred from the March 11th, 2020 board meeting. I'm not sure if finance staff have any introductory comments.
Is there any introductory comments from our finance staff? Ms. Weiner.
No, actually, I was just popping in to say no. The report is as it was. It's just coming back as it was left at the meeting.
All right. Is there a resolution? No, this is for direction. What's the committee's pleasure? Director Wilson.
Yeah, I'm fully supportive of this one. I don't see a problem at all. We've got some great volunteers. Let's show them how much we appreciate them.
Okay, so okay, hang on. I'm going to make a director's list. We've got Acton, Kuhn. We have Director Nicholson. Anyone else? Director Acton, go ahead. Once again, this is been referred back. I think there's a resolution embedded in the body of the report here. So we would probably have to have that resolution put on the floor. Director Acton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This, I think, came back because also I was requesting more funds be given to the APCs and Parks Commissions, and partly because Area B also has a larger population of volunteers in those groups, that our allotted amount was not enough. Unfortunately, I have just been called over for a family emergency. I might have to take a call in a few minutes, so I won't be part of the conversation. But so I just, I know it's a tough time right now with raising any requisition. I guess it would just be nice to know if we had at least a buffer to cover some of that, some of those expenses, so that we could properly appreciate our ABCs and Parks Commissions. If if we were even able to this year. So it's probably something we won't even be able to know if we're going to be able to execute on it this year anyway. But so that's where the conversation comes from.
So thank you, Director Acton, and I'd like to call Ms. Weiner back to the meeting because I think that we've budgeted, I know for sure we had $800 per electoral area in the budget. I thought we'd attempted to bump it up for the 2020 budget to 12. Did we actually get there? I know there was a suggestion for 15. Is there a possibility of us through reserves? I believe the reserve for this was huge, that we could easily make a proactive resolution to make the amount per electoral area $1,200, but there hasn't been a resolution to that effect yet, correct?
Correct. The motion that was put to the board was to increase it from $800 to $1,200. And in that motion, the number two part of that motion was to increase the budget line by $3,600 and transfer from operating reserves by $3,600.
Okay,
and that motion went to the board and then was referred back to the EASC for consideration. Sorry.
So thank you. So I think that's kind of the realm that I think Director Acton was working in, that we had an amount. It's already in the budget. I think Director Acton was actually hoping to go to 15, and maybe a couple of others were. But I think there has been a resolution that's already been tested at 12. And so I'll go to the speakers. We've got Director Kuhn and Director Nicholson. Director Kuhn. Speaker.
I'm ready to move to a resolution to increase it to 1,200.
We have a seconder in Director Salmon or Wilson. Yep, looks like it. So it's been moved and seconded. I'll go to Director Nicholson, who is next on the speakers list.
Just hang on, I'm just looking for I keep getting frozen here. I feel part of this issue is about being able to deliver on the policy, which is recognizing APCs, parks commissions, and important community groups doing work in the community. And I think it really speaks to Director Acton's concern about having sufficient funds to do it equitably across the electoral areas, given the size of electoral area B. And I know I have been challenged because my area has, 3 or 4 separate communities and different associations and so forth, all doing good work for the community. So what it means is in a small centralized community, if you want to do a volunteer appreciation event, you can probably do it well for $1,000. But if you're dealing with an area like mine, it is perhaps a little bit more challenging to do the same style of event. So it might mean something quite different. So I'm thinking about whether it would be possible to allocate funding more on the basis of a per capita situation.
Ms. Weiner, I think that was for you. Ms. Weiner, is there a challenge or a possibility, not challenge in per capita a lot, but I think this budget is not set up for that, but Ms., go ahead.
No, that would be a lot of it more administration work to divvy up how much would go for each of the different areas. Right now, it's a set amount. It's included in the budget, and it would also need a change to the bylaw.
Thank you. I've got Director Salmon and Director Smith, and just I'd like to briefly comment. Every area is a little bit unique in their makeup, and I think that it's not just about APCs and parks commissions. I have 5 different fire departments that operate within electoral area F, and I generally try and bring, I can't afford to bring all fire chiefs or deputy chiefs to a volunteer appreciation dinner, so I have to pick and choose from one to another. If $800 is nowhere near enough to do this properly in my smaller population electoral area, 1,200 would be great. 15 would be a lot better. I don't know how Director Acton does it with such a huge population and the number of active volunteers in her community. So just a comment. I'll go to Director Salmon next.
Yeah, thank you. Just alcohol. I noticed staff report suggests that we not cover alcohol, which I agree with. So I'm wondering, do we need to specify that?
We don't cover alcohol.
We do? We don't.
We do not cover alcohol.
Yeah, just in the report, it suggests that it may be advisable to amend the policy to provide specific direction on not allowing expenses for alcohol and ensuring any cash transactions meet audit standards. So just flagging that while we're on the wording.
Thank you, Director Salmon. Director Smith.
Thank you. I have a smaller area, but I also have a complicated area because I have multiple volunteers on Thetis Island. It's a very amazing community with a lot of community good work for the community. So I have a lot of volunteers on Thetis Island, and then I have a lot of volunteers in Saltaire. So I can understand the complications of funding because I have a body of water in between the two, which creates the need for obviously sort of two different events. So as much as I think that the 1,200 is a good amount, I think that 1,500 would definitely have us not back at this table in the next couple of years, because all the areas are growing. There's more happening in each area, and I would like to defeat this motion of 1,200 and bring a recommendation of 1,500. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Smith. So I see no other hands in the air. I'm gonna pose this. We can follow Director Smith's recommendation and defeat this resolution and consider another resolution, another course of action that we might do, given all eyes and ears are on us, as we might consider this resolution and also recommend that we consider a larger amount during budget discussions for the 2021 budget. So it's your pleasure. The resolution before us is that the budget be increased to 1,200 and that the amount be, I think it was $3,600, be added to the line item. I think Ms. Weiner had the information at hand. I was about to call the question and Director Nicholson raised her hand again. So Director Nicholson, I'll recognize you to close.
Okay, so I guess I need some clarification. I thought we were talking about a policy, but are we actually talking about expenditures for this year or next year as well, or how does that work?
We can bring staff in, but the resolution that had gone forward to the board previously, which I think Director Kuhn had reiterated, was that the amount for this year be $1,200 and that the staff make the appropriate changes to the budget to make that happen. I believe that it's up to our discretion whether we want to have this discussion again during the budget, which is just about upon us, but I turn to Ms. Weiner.
Yes, Mr. Chair, you are correct. The motion was for the 2020 budget, and that was to amend the policy and amend the budget to bring the amounts up to $1,200 from $800, and that the funds to do the increase was taken from operating reserves. So the 2021 budget will give the committee time to revisit, and they can make increases at that point in time.
Follow-up, Director Nicholson.
So I guess I question the appropriateness of actually having a dollar figure in the policy. I think it's really important to appreciate our volunteers, but I do think that the appropriateness of having lavish expenditures this year for volunteer appreciation was probably not appropriate. I certainly wouldn't do it in my area. And again, I think it speaks to generally having a discussion about how we are approaching budgeting for the following year, where we have quite a bit more flexibility on the budget issue in relation to COVID and those discussions. So I guess my preference would be to take the dollar amount out of the policy and have that, just leave it as a budget discussion issue, and maybe discuss what the limit should be for this year, just given the COVID thing.
So I'm not seeing, I didn't hear a motion, I didn't hear a seconder, and I think that if I'm understanding how our policies work, we actually have a dollar figure in the policy and in the budget. We have a resolution on the floor, and I'll just sort of recap what has been suggested at this point. The resolution is for $1,200, up from $800, and that those monies come from reserve. There's also been a suggestion that the motion be defeated and that the amount can be increased to, there would be a subsequent resolution that would bring the dollar figure up to $1,500. I think that, so we've got essentially two ways: defeat the motion and bring a subsequent for 15. We've got a resolution where we could approve the 12 or recommend approval of the 12, and we could have this discussion, including everything that's been brought forward by Director Nicholson and others during budget, which is, as I say, upon us. So at this point, we have a duly moved and seconded unamended resolution on the floor for $1,200. You've heard the discussion. I'm going to now call the question. All those in favor? Are there any opposed? Director Nicholson opposed. That recommendation carries. I still think it's an appropriate discussion to have at budget in the upcoming months. Next item, let me back out of that one to, I think we have to go to UB2 next. And I'm having trouble with my screen. UB2 will be Mr. Tippett, I understand. Where's Mr. Tippett? I see his screen. I don't see his face. There is his face. And so we've got, we got Mr. Tippett, Ms. Chirulf, and we also have the subsequent information from alternate director Haim, but I see Ms. Chirulf has put her finger up. So I'll acknowledge Ms. Chirulf first and to introduce the discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to acknowledge that Jeff Garbett from the RDN is now on the call as well, and I'll defer to Mr. Tippett.
Thank you and welcome, Mr. Garbett. And Mr. Tippett, please regale us.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon. I'm not sure if I'll regale you. The story is a little bit on the dull side, but I prepared a report for the Regional Services Committee. The committee, the information, it's regarding a referral from the Regional District of Nanaimo concerning some bylaw amendments they're proposing in the vicinity and on the site of the Nanaimo Airport. And that committee, on balance, that there were some matters that ought to be spoken to in this committee, and therefore it was referred here. Now, I haven't made any amendments to the recommendation that went before the Regional Services Committee last week, I believe it was, where the director, Director Haim, has prepared some supplementary information, which I believe is a new business item that's related to this. And as I understand it, I think he's still supportive of the staff recommendation. However, he has some additional wishes to bring forward to the Regional District of Nanaimo for consideration. So that's my introduction. I don't know if that was constituting a regaling or not, but that's it.
Close enough. And thank you for that. And just, Mr. Tippett, for your information, the information, and I'm going to go to Alternate Director Haim next. The nature of the information is that it wasn't new business, but it's supplemental to the UB2 package. And so I'm going to turn to Alternate Director Haim to provide his comments and perhaps some written information and possible resolutions in regards to what he has distributed in advance of this meeting to his colleagues around the table. So, Alternate Director Haim, floor is yours.
Thank you. First of all, just I note that Mr. Garbett from the RDN is in on the meeting. Is he here just for questions, or has he seen the late report that I distributed? Just the question to staff with regards to that.
Mr. Chair, with your permission, I shared with Mr. Garbett yesterday, Alternate Director proposed resolution in draft form, and so he's generally familiar with it. I think he was here mostly with an expectation of perhaps answering any technical questions that might have come up in the course of the discussion in the committee. So I don't think he was expecting to make a presentation or anything like that.
How's that work for you, Alternate Director Haim?
Works fantastic. I'd like to welcome Mr. Garbett. It's been a while since I've seen him, so good to see you, Jeff. Directors, you have before you the report that I put together with regards to concerns from a mostly planning perspective with regards to the OCP and zoning amendments for the airport lands. As noted in my report, the airport lands historically have always been a bit of a quandary. There's a difference of opinion between the RDN and the Airport Commission as to jurisdiction, et cetera. So the comments that I have put together ignore that difference of opinion, and I'm treating it just as if it was any other OCP or zoning amendment where there was no other jurisdiction, such as the federal government in that respect. My biggest concern revolves around clarity and also the adjacent lands. As noted in my recommended resolution, I've got concerns in the fact that airport isn't defined, and it is one of the things where historically there has been disagreement with regards to what constitutes an airport use and what is ancillary to the airport itself. So I was looking for clarification and or reference for the definition of airport going forward, recognizing again the adjacent area H lands. There's lands where there's currently occupied by the Cottonwood Golf Course, labeled within the management plan or the land development plan of the Airport Commission as future aviation, whereas the RDN is looking to zone it the same as the existing lands that are currently used for the airport. Again, clarity with regards to future aviation and potential uses, recognizing the agricultural land next door and also the current golf course use on the agricultural land. The third item revolves around setbacks. Within our draft OCP or the harmonized OCP, we give guidance with regards to landscape buffering that would be required on non-agricultural lands adjacent to agricultural lands. And in addition to that, the Agricultural Land Commission has landscape buffering setback specifications that have been in place for 20 plus years, revolving around things like noise and visual, and they provide guidance there, which is substantially more than the proposed 5 meters on the part of the Regional District of Nanaimo. And then the last thing is the concern with regards to the Cassidy Aquifer. It does not know the jurisdictional boundaries with regards to the water, the source, both quality and quantity. So in that regard there, the consideration of possible inclusion, but certainly progressive information sharing with regards to the memorandum of agreement proposed between the RDN and the Nanaimo Airport Commission in lieu of a development permit area, which, you know, in my eyes would have been the appropriate way to handle it, although I do understand the reasoning and rationale for the memorandum of agreement. So in light of that, I have a recommended resolution. Mr. Chair, I assume you would want me to read that out completely?
Can I ask you to hold for just a second, because I want to have the committee have some context, because in all the time that I've been here, we've very rarely ever gone into this sort of context around a referral from a neighboring jurisdiction. So perhaps this might be an appropriate time for either Mr. Tippett and or Mr. Garbett to maybe Mr. Tippett could explain our normal process and how we respond to these things. And I think Alternate Director Haim has done some great work on this. I don't know whether it's a resolution that would include all of this information and how helpful this would be from the receiving end and Mr. Garbett. So first, Mr. Tippett, could you just give us a little context as to the normal procedure and the extent that we would be providing comment and how we could incorporate those comments through perhaps Director Haim's resolution to the board, and if that would help Mr. Garbett in their process at the Nanaimo Regional District. Does that sound reasonable?
Okay, I can't speak for Mr. Garbett, so he'll have to speak to that. But what I can say is we often get referrals from adjacent local governments, both within our region, our municipal partners, and sometimes adjacent regional districts, or I don't know if we ever get municipalities outside of our region referring to us, but staff always looks at it and looks for the regional district's interest in respect of it. Many of these things are dealt with at the moment at a staff level. If they're just minor, let's say in Port Renfrew, a pub expansion or something like that. But in this case, there is a long history of the the proximity, I guess, of the airport, first of all, to Electoral Area H, and having been quite involved in Area H issues over the years, working with APC members, I know there are the issues of which Alternate Director Haim were speaking are key and are thought of very deeply in that community. And so I completely understand, his desire to bring some of those issues forward. And it's just my opinion, but I think the way that he's framed the resolution is respectful, and in my mind, if it could be part of the resolution, that would probably help. I think the idea is that it says that we would support the Regional District of Nanaimo in their initiative. However, we are in consideration 4 points of further information. And, in my mind, at least, I won't speak for Angie or someone more familiar with the procedures, but that would give the clarity RDN board could then use in determining what they wish to do. Now, I think we're well into the realm. Garbett should step in and talk about that if there's, because ultimately they would be the receiving end of this communication.
That's a perfect intro and explanation, and I'd like to go to Mr. Garbett to ask if what's been discussed so far is going to be a helpful addition to your process. Mr. Garbett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through to Director Haim. Thank you for the welcome. It's good to see you. It's odd to have you as director for Area H and not for the former Area D and with the City of Lanceville. So thank you very much. If that's not inappropriate. With respect to the 4 recommendations, I could provide a little bit of clarity. Airport is a evolving term. A lot of that's been developed through case law. So our advice was to not include an airport definition. In terms of the Cottonwood Golf Course lands, again, airport has gone through a master planning exercise, and the guidance that comes when airports are doing that is that local government should follow that direction. So the Cottonwood Golf Course is not currently recognized in the existing rural 4 zoning, nor is the community plan policy there. So it was always envisioned in the Electoral Area A of the RDN that if the airport ever ceased operating, it would go back to a rural use, and the Cottonwood Golf Course was developed prior to the existing policies there. With respect to setbacks and buffering to the land in the Agricultural Land Commission, if it's not aviation uses, the existing development permit areas, which in Area A of the RDN, we have a farmland protection DP, which would institute such measures for setback. as well as the aquifer protection development permit area. So what's in front of you as directors to provide us some referral comments is the changes to the existing electoral area A OCP. So we already have development permits in place for farmland protection and aquifer protection. Again, that would apply if they tried to go away from aviation uses in the future. And subsequently, the agriculture, the zoning of that property would also have to be changed to accommodate some non-aviation uses. And with respect to the MOA, I can advise we've been diligently working away for about 6 years to try and develop a MOA. If the Cowichan Valley Regional District would want to be informed as part of that, we certainly do that at a staff level. And I'm not sure if the Cowichan Valley would be exploring their own MOA, given that the lands are within our respective regional districts. And we would very much appreciate the detailed comments. And that's all I had. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Garbutt, and thank you and both Mr. Tippett for that context and framework. And Alternate Director Haim, I turn to you, and what's your pleasure?
Okay, first of all, just a bit of a response to Mr. Garbutt. The reference, for example, to the setback would be that if it reverted to the alternative use as opposed to the airport, it would apply. However, it is incorporated within the zoning bylaw aspects itself as it stands as an airport with a 5-meter setback. And I personally, I don't see anything preventing from putting the 15 or 20 meter as guided by the Agricultural Land Commission in terms of it. As a general statement, I'm also a realist. These are suggestions, these are comments. What the Regional District of Nanaimo chooses to do with them is up to them. But with regards to what my pleasure is, I would still like these things to be put on record and sent to the Regional District of Nanaimo. And that from that standpoint, we've upheld, in my opinion, our responsibility to our residents, and they're going to do likewise with regards to their residents and the land users. So based on that, I'd like to move the recommended resolution that it be recommended to the board meeting on June the 10th, 2020, that the Regional District of Nanaimo be advised that the Cowichan Valley Regional District supports the proposed bylaw amendments in the vicinity of the Nanaimo Airport with the following comments for consideration. Number 1, the term airport is not defined, nor is reference made to definitions elsewhere, such as the Aeronautics Act. It is suggested that the airport be defined to provide clarity around the uses, specifically as it relates to Development Area A. Number 2, the lands currently occupied by the Cottonwood Golf Course are identified as future aviation in the Nanaimo Airport Commission Land Development Plan, which is not defined. Both the NAC and the RDN support the continued operation of the Cottonwood Golf Course, and until future aviation is defined, it is suggested that the lands be zoned to their current use. Number 3, for the lands immediately adjacent to the CVRD Area H agricultural lands, it is suggested that the required setbacks and landscape buffering be increased from 5 meters to those specified by the ALC landscape buffer specifications. And number 4, the CVRD understands the use of the Memorandum of Agreement rather than the development permit process. Recognizing the impacts on surrounding properties are normally publicly reviewed as part of the DP process and allow for public comment from surrounding properties. It is suggested that at a minimum, the CVRD be kept informed in the development of the Memorandum of Agreement and be considered for participation in the development and the opportunity to become party to the agreement.
And that's duly moved by Alternate Director Haim, seconded by Director Smith. Any discussion on that item? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Are there any opposed? I see none opposed. That motion carries. And Alternate Director Haim, Excellent work, and thank you to staff and to Mr. Garbett for joining us. And we don't get to do these sort of things at committee level very often, and I think you've really provided us with some good information on as to your process. So thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Garbett, and Mr. Tippett as well. Thank you. So that carries us through UB1 and UB2, and that now brings us to new business. And this is a discussion item. And let me just refer back to why we brought it up in the first place. So at the board, I'll give you a brief introduction, then perhaps turn to Ms. Chiralf. At the board, we had discussed the possible challenges for business in the restart programs around COVID-19, and they're reasonable topic for discussion, and staff have gone away and looked at what our regulations and bylaws and enforcement practices and the like are. I had some discussion with them last week, and Ms. Chiralf has taken it upon herself to provide some background, what our policies are, and where we might go forward from here. So I think given that, she's distributed some information for us, just the CVRD policies and regulations that are in place, and we can go round table or just discuss it as we see fit. But I'll turn to Ms. Chiralf to introduce the topic from her perspective.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the topic, I think this came up because the board considered the option to pre-approve applications going to the Liquor and Cannabis Regulation Branch in regard to temporary license applications. So those are for licensed establishments who need to expand their businesses to comply with physical distancing requirements and other provincial health orders. And so the question came up, essentially, how can the CVRD assist businesses? So I sort of thought about that a little bit, and you know, you come to the conclusion quickly that regional districts actually don't have a lot of authority with respect to regulating businesses. It's a bit different than it is for municipalities. You can, of course, enact zoning regulations. You can have development permit areas, so you can, enact regulation that doesn't actually help business necessarily. And in order to sort of vary those regulations that you put into place, you need to amend your bylaws, or you need to implement them through the issuance of permits. So we don't get away from land use regulation. You're not able to regulate businesses through business licenses. If a business wants to encroach into a public roadway, they would need to get the permission from the Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure. So that's quite different than what would happen in a municipality. You can't, of course, under the community charter, provide any kind of direct support or financial assistance to businesses. That's not permitted. And so if businesses in electoral areas in particular are wanting to modify their operations in order to comply with provincial health orders, what we're encouraging them to do is to talk to staff to determine on a case-by-case basis what the specific requirements are for their business. Obviously, the requirements are going to vary depending on where they are. And, we work with them to the best of our ability to ensure that they can do what they need to do in order to make their businesses successful. If we find that we have a bylaw enforcement complaint, so if somebody complains that a business is, not complying with our bylaws, or they haven't taken out a permit, our bylaw enforcement staff will follow the policy that we have in place, which again is to seek to obtain voluntary compliance first, and then we go to ticketing enforcement as a last resort. So you do have the option as a board to modify your enforcement policy in relation to specific matters. This might happen, in local government on a matter like affordable housing, for instance. You might say that we don't want to enforce against secondary suites because they're providing affordable housing, and we're working through the development of policies around secondary suites. So that's just an example. So you can look at your enforcement policy and say, are there things that we want to not enforce? And then, you know, implement that through a formal resolution. So you can do that, but I would advise, if that's something that you want to consider, that we would get some legal advice on how we would do that, and to ensure that the CVRD is still maintaining a reasonable standard of care to the public. Thank you.
Thank you, and that was great information, and thank you for sending out the material that you did. It's a good refresher to reread that information, and just as a general comment, it looks like we have most of what we need already contained within our regulations and bylaws now, but I think this is an important discussion to be had. So far, I have Director Salmon, and my whole screen just changed, so he moved from where he was. Is there anyone else who would like to provide comment, have any discussion on this item? Was Director Nicholson, was that you putting your hand up? No? Yes? No? Director Salmon, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. So just a question for Mr. Rolfe on the policy. I just, that term municipal ticket information bylaw, I'm not familiar with. What is, are we using is that a CVRD bylaw? Are we using a municipal, why is it called municipal?
It's a standard. It's essentially a ticketing authorization bylaw. And MTI is just the standard terminology. It could be called something else, but that's just what they're called. Mr. McDonald might want to add something to that, but it is the bylaw that allows our bylaw enforcement staff to issue tickets, essentially.
Just wondered if it was sort of modeled on the standard municipal format or something.
My understanding is that it's sort of a pretty standard thing throughout, and the discussion of whether or not we should call the electoral areas the MTI came up at the time that this was created, but I think it's a pretty standard system. Mr. McDonald's nodding, yes. Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
Any other discussion on this information? It was referred to us to consider at committee. I think we've all had a chance to read the information. Oh, welcome back, Director Acton. Any other discussion? Well, seeing none, I think we can move off this item and trust that our bylaw enforcement staff will do what's appropriate. And if our community members see things that are of interest or concern, that they contact staff. And we also will encourage any business owners that are engaging and restarting providing services to the community, if they want to do something different from their previous format of providing services, and they think it may be an issue outside of their normal practices, that they reach out and talk to the CVRD staff, and I'm sure they'll be very helpful in that process. So with that, that takes us to question period, and I believe that the email address has been up during the course of this meeting, and I know that we're probably due for a break, but we're so close and we have no closed session that I think we should go to Ms. Legault. I see lots of nodding. And Ms. Legault, is there any questions from people watching the meeting today that for the chair that I might answer? And before you read them out, there was a question at our last meeting in regards to the public participation and input, and the question around APCs and parks commissions, and also public hearings. And discussions with staff are that we will be getting a report coming forward to the June 17th meeting that will provide information and perhaps a process moving forward where we can engage in virtual public hearings, maybe even some in-person public hearings, and that people can have a practical way to engage with elected officials in the committee and the board. So those will be coming. I said that I would get back to the questioner from our last meeting, and that's the response to the question of when can they expect there to be some information coming forward on participation. So with that, I'll turn to Ms. Legault. Do you have a question from the public today?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do. I'm just opening the email here. This is a submission from Susan Kaufman. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair. Despite earlier discussions about editorializing public input, has the CVRD become so inflexible that it was necessary to delete my first point of acknowledging this is Canada Environment Week and today is Canada Fair Day? If so, then it is a sad day for our community that we can't pay homage to these federal proclamations. A second.
Well, I'll answer the first question. The CVRD does not engage in proclamations or declarations, and it wasn't pertaining to anything on the on today's agenda. There was no reference to the item, so it was dropped. Next question.
Mr. Chair, this is also from Susan Kaufman. Has the public been so marginalized that comments from the public are held in ridicule? On an item on today's agenda, let a spirited response from a director. Shouldn't this be an opportunity for leadership and a meeting be facilitated with those of opposing views to work together in a situation where one group may be held above or below another when both are working with good intentions for the benefit of the community?
I'm going to have to ask you to reread that because I got lost somewhere in that question. Could you please reread it? Maybe go a little slower.
Sorry about that. Mr. Chair, has the public been so marginalized that comments from the public are held in ridicule? An item on today's agenda led a spirited response from the director of the area. Shouldn't this be an opportunity for leadership and a meeting be facilitated with those opposing views to work together? It is unfortunate to see a situation where one group may be held above or below another when both are working with good intentions for the benefit of the community.
Well, I question very simply is in regards to my response would be that I think any group that is working with the CVRD or individual directors would be it'd be more than appropriate they reach out and engage and have discussions, forthright discussions, and I don't know that I would interpret the characterization from the question in the same way. I think that the director in the item, and I think it was in regards to the grant and aid, spoke in a forthright manner into the nature of the grant and aid and her feelings on the issue, and invited community members and organizations to reach out and contact her, and I'll leave my answer at that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There are no other items.
Thank you, Ms. Legault. So with that, I turn to committee, and we have no closed session. It would be more than appropriate to entertain a resolution to close. Moved by Director Kuhn, seconded by Director Yanni DiNardo. All those in favor? Any opposed? None opposed. Motion carries. Thank you, everyone, for your attendance and hard work.
Thank you. Enjoy your evening.
Enjoy your evening, everyone. Take care.